Hello, Internet, and thank you very much for tuning into the Cloud Native FM podcast and the Cloud Native Podcast YouTube channel. I'm your host for your today's session, where GitOps is going. My name is Saim Safdar. I am a co-founder of Cloud Native Islamabad, and also am the organizer of KCD Islamabad that is happening in May 3rd. If you are around in Islamabad, make sure to visit the to join the conference and get to able to know what are the folks up to, where the technology is heading, and we have some bunch together a wonderful content for you. I predicting you would definitely like it. But today's session is all about GitOps, where it is going, how actually we can actually capture the word of GitOps, and how to be able to understand what is good fit for me and what it is interesting that I love about. For able to answer those questions and some key takeaway from the KubeCoN Paris recently happened last month, I invited this time Michael Crenshaw to give us a shiny new updates on the world of GitOps and some of the new releasing coming up. And we will talk about some of the new releases Kubernetes, that is Kubernetes v.130. But without any further delay, let's go straight to Michael. Thank you very much, Michael, for being on the show again. Over to you, your quick intro, and what you're excited about these days.
Thanks for having me back. Yeah, so everybody, I'm Michael Crenshaw. I work for Intuit as a staff software engineer on our Argo CD and Argo Rollouts team. So I help keep those services up for our internal developer platform. And I'm also a maintainer of Argo CD on the open source side. Yeah, so I live and breathe Argo and GitOps. So I'm excited to talk about some of that.
Yes, absolutely. And Michael is your go-to resource because he's been done some incredible work for the Argo CD. I think it existed. I happened to see what happening just to follow where the Michael is, and then the news come up to my stage to understand where we're actually heading. So it's nice to see folks joining us on the YouTube chat. Thanks, Philip, for joining us. It's been great. I hope to see more folks in the chat as well. So, Michael, let's chat about which can go with before we go to the nitty-gritty details of what the GitOps is or what the keynote or key takeaways from recently GitOps Con in the KubeCon Paris. But I wanted to learn from you today. What is GitOps in 2024?
Uh, Good question. So GitOps in general is, I think the best summary of it is ops by pull request. So it's kind of a side effect of the fact that when you have a declarative configuration system like Kubernetes, you've got text files basically that declare the state of your system. You can have some tool automatically deploy that configuration for you. And then the only thing you have to do to make a change is to go into Git, open a pull request, get someone to review it. The moment the pull request is merged, now your system's state is updated, which is super nice because developers know Git, they like Git. It makes it very simple to do your operations. What is GitOps in 2024 is a super interesting question because I've been thinking about a lot the evolution of GitOps. I think that there's sort of strong GitOps and weak GitOps. And in 2024, a lot of GitOps is what I would call weak GitOps, where you don't have the entire state of a given system represented in one branch of one Git repository. It tends to be kind of scattered. Maybe you have a Helm chart that does Helm lookups, so it's pulling state from your cluster. You've got an application set that pulls information from cluster secrets and injects that information right before deploying your changes. In other words, some of the state of your system doesn't exist in your Git repository, at least the one that your developer is interacting with. So I think a lot of folks resonate with the weak GitOps strategy because it solves the problems that they have, collecting information, getting it deployed. I think that we're starting to see some of the downsides of that approach, especially when it comes to IDPs. because developers start to feel like they're not entirely in control of the state of their system, and they can't rely on the GitOps deployment system to do what they ask it to do. So some of what I've been working on is trying to describe the tooling that is required to take us towards a more strong GitOps future and the benefits that that can provide.
Absolutely. That's pretty much actually we've seen a common debate in the industry as well as Michael describing. And I also see one of our friend, Carlos Santana. Hi, Carlos. Thanks for joining. He mentioned the weak, strong, and the purest GitOps. Oh,
Yeah,
good one, Michael.
Carlos and I talked about this, 3 days ago at GitOpsCon. The term purist tends to get negatively interpreted. There are kind of negative connotations around it. I do think it's important to be pragmatic. So to me, strong GitOps would be about pragmatically trying to get more state in the developer's view in Git, without forcing like difficult, toilsome operations on behalf of the developer in order to get done what they need to get done. And for that, we need tooling.
Yes, absolutely. And my next question is similar to this one, but I like to learn from you as well. What do ops and dev have in common for operating in GitOps environment?
What do ops and dev have in common? I think that both ops and dev, sort of two sides of the deployment organization, they want to have a very clear picture of the live state of their system. I think that's the piece they have in common. And they both want to be in charge of the piece that is their job and not in charge of the pieces that are not their job. So the dev is like, I want to run this container image, but maybe they're not super concerned about the exact configuration of the HPA. The ops folks say, okay, I want the HPA to be sized correctly so that we're not wasting resources and so that like peak traffic doesn't destroy the service. But I'm not so concerned about what container image you're running. That's your job. In both cases, they want to have a clear picture of the current state, but only the pieces that they care about. And they only want to be in control and responsible for the configuration that has to do with their job.
Yes, absolutely. And with platform engineering, we're actually heading toward that paradigm that there are separation of concern between two entities. Because dev is always complaining to us as a DevOps engineer that I need this, I need that, I don't have permission to do this. I want to run this stuff on this cluster. I want to access this namespace. Why not that the DevOps team can give you the entire entity, that the cluster, and then is basically that what you require, that's the requirement that you have to run the GitOps, and that requirement is fulfilled by the DevOps engineer, and then you're actually operating it. So I think we see a lot of debates compared to the past. Right now we have some separation of duties or separation of concern between these two entities in order to be more proficient. And I think to speak about what GitOps in 2024, some of the ops and dev paradigm. Now, one topic I see a lot coming in the debates is what are the essential component of a production ready GitOps powered platform architecture. Sorry for some very buzzword, but over to you now.
You're good. Yeah. So it depends a lot on the environment. I think that some basic things that everyone needs though are you need a GitOps controller. You need something that can do the deployments for you from Git repositories to your clusters. You need to have some sense for how you're going to manage the connection of those clusters. If it's just a few, maybe that's a very simple setup. If you're going to be dynamically adding and subtracting clusters, you need to make sure that you are prepared to inform your GitOps controller about those additions and subtractions and that it's not too painful. You need to have some strategy for secret management, like developer facing secrets. So you need to decide what secret operator you want to use, and what backend you're going to use to store those secrets. Talk about how you're going to have your developers put secrets where they belong and access them. And I think you're going to need to set up your basically whatever multi-tenancy strategy you need. So if it's a very small organization, you don't have many teams, maybe, for example, everyone has all access to all clusters, but by default, you're only allowed to deploy namespace level resources. You're not allowed to do cluster resources. If you have a very big organization like what Intuit has, you might find that you need to set up a new project with new permissions specific to one team for one service and give them access to one namespace on one cluster. Creating the RBAC and the project restrictions for those services is a lot of work. So you've got to be ready to write that code. But most importantly, just have a strategy for each of those things, decide what's appropriate for your scale, and then bounce the ideas off of some of the open source and business community just to make sure you're on the right path. There's really no wrong way to do it, just as long as you've thought things through ahead of time.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And we do have some very common friend in the chat. Thanks, Zubair, to see you in the chat as well. And Zubair is saying that Michael is in the flesh, and I thought he was on or a myth or an AI bot.
As far as anyone knows, I still could be an AI bot. I guess Carlos saw me at GitOps but that might have been a hologram.
Yes, absolutely. And I think like we mentioned like some of the production ready things. Do you think having an updated, always up to date cluster or up to date release of Argo CD is important for a lot of the business related tasks? Or is it important, or is it kind of a production ready feature that the platform or the DevOps team should aim for?
It is important to stay within the most recent 3 GA versions because that's the period for which we deploy security fixes. So I would recommend a couple of things. One, have a strategy to stay on the most recent patch of whatever release you're running. If you're using the Helm chart, they do a great job of making sure the patches are available. And then have a strategy to do those minor version bumps about every year, every 2 months, or every 6 months, something like that, just to make sure that you're within the security SLA. I've seen folks running like 2.1, and there's some very severe security vulnerabilities that they might be exposed to because they're not on a newer version. So have some strategy to stay reasonably up to date.
Yes, absolutely. And I try to share a blog with the people as well, or I try to share my screen and see if that Michael and me can actually roll you up for some of the recent release of the Argo CD 2.11. So I hope people can see my screen. And Michael, can you get us there? What is the most excited one? But I can tell you mine one is this one. This is really, really great one to the addition in the Argo CD UI.
Yeah, I saw recently someone called Argo CD the most popular observability tool in the Kubernetes ecosystem. It's a pretty strong statement, but it gets to people want to know what is happening in their cluster, and features like this just help you keep track of who's doing what. So that's a big one. I think the most exciting for me is this second one, improved monorepo support. So this gets a little bit into the weeds, but I'll preface it with I like monorepos for manifests, particularly for small to mid-sized organizations. At my last role, actually, Zach Aller and Zach does Argo Rollouts. We maintained a platform for a smaller to mid-sized org, and we had a monorepo for manifests. And what that meant is if we as a platform needed to do some upgrades, we could just do one set of like one bash script with JQ queries across all the manifests, do the upgrade, commit, we're done. You can't do that when your manifests are scattered across thousands of repositories. The problem with a monorepo is Argo CD struggles when pulling, generating manifests, and pushing out the changes for all of those services represented in a single repository. One way to mitigate its struggles doing that is to set an annotation which says, okay, as a developer, I know the only manifests I care about for this app are in this path. Say it's called My Service A. Argo CD then gets to skip a lot of work when it's generating your manifests. And this is a change that makes it so that Argo CD is able to skip that work, not just when you have webhooks configured to push to Argo CD, but in general, Argo CD can always skip a ton of work and push out your changes from a mono repo much more quickly. Yeah, this was a really, really great feature, and a huge shout out to Alexi from GoTo for writing that code.
Yes, and we will definitely spoke about this one is really, really interesting as well. A multi-resource application goodness. I think the one thing I really like about is for this feature that allow you to group information from multiple places, from a public Helm chart, your local values file to form a single Argo CD application. Because sometime for some demo purposes, I need those kind of functionality.
Yeah, and I also like this feature because it lets you implement a pretty simple IDP. I talked to a company recently that was just setting up its Kubernetes IDP, and they wanted a central Helm chart that the platform team would maintain, and then the developer interface would be a values.yaml file. Multi-sources lets you set this up for the developer and say, okay, if you put your values file here, and you use the API that we describe in the documentation there, we will handle the rest. We will inflate those manifests, set up everything you need for your application, and you don't have to worry about anything but your values file. So the improvements in 2.11 expand the interface for managing those multi-source apps, especially in the CLI. So it used to be you'd have to manage it mostly through like kubectl, or manual interaction with the UI. This just builds out the support and makes it a more robust feature set.
Yes, and speaking of cluster sharding, and I'd want to hear from you what it is and why it is important and what's new actually coming up.
So cluster sharding is about spreading the workload for deploying all of these manifests to your clusters across multiple pods. So multiple application controllers is what we call them. This is challenging because you have to decide how to avoid controllers fighting with each other. And the way we avoided that in the past was we said, okay, each controller manages some subset of your clusters. Say you have 20 clusters, you have 5 different application controllers, that's your sharding. You've spread that workload somewhat. The problem is the algorithm that places cluster management on different shards doesn't balance that work very well. And it can't balance that work very well because it doesn't know which of your clusters are big, which of yours are just like test clusters that you spun up for a few hours. So it just places them randomly into different shards. AWS and a few other orgs have done great work analyzing how we can write algorithms to spread this work more evenly so that you don't have one application controller pod that's given 20 gigabytes of memory and it's only using 2 of it, while another pod is using 30 gigs of memory when you only gave it 20. So this is amazing stuff. It's a bit more in the weeds. People probably won't need to dive into these features until they're running Argo CD at a pretty massive scale. For the most part, you can use one shard and just keep throwing CPU and memory at it. But at some point, you might need to use some of these more advanced features.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the cordless is also here. There's a bunch of SNU. In SNU, they're working on some of these kind of stuff as well on the CNCF Slack channel, and some of the work they have done has been really delightful for this space as well. So glad to see some of the innovation happening in this space. And one other from all these other notable changes, which one you pick, Michael? I can be.
Good question. I'd have to glance through and make sure I remember what each is. The first one is actually very exciting to me just because it's a new feature for apps in any namespace. To me, GitOps is all about empowering developers, and the apps in any namespace feature makes it easier for developers to self-serve their GitOps configuration. I think that feature was a huge step forward for Argo CD, and anything that we can do to make that feature more robust is massive for the ecosystem, in my opinion.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one thing I really like about it, because I do struggle in the past, they added a new ability to auto label cluster for Kubernetes cluster info. This can be a small thing, but these are very delightful things to add into the new feature, because sometimes you want to have more information coming out of the cluster. So that is another delightful. And also, I think they added a new option to specify an AWS profile to use by Argo CD server when adding an EKS cluster. That's one is so cool. So was some very good work happening in the world, and some very good chat happening in the YouTube description. So Mark, I think Sanu saying Carlos is saying that Sanu creating an IDP and GitOps bridge using this. I think it's talking about sharding. Good one.
Yeah, I'm
Uh,
excited about that project.
Yes, and also Carlos is saying is monorepo and application set are very helpful. That's a very good comment. And Luke Phillips is saying and very dangerous as well. Oh, great.
Yes, if you use application sets without great care, it's easy to mess things up. So read those docs, folks.
Yes, absolutely. And I will include the link in the YouTube description as well. But thanks, Michael. You actually phrasing wonderfully well, and Costas for the great blog on describing all these feature. But I do have some more questions before we wrap up, and some are very interesting one, able to see what other folks are talking about. I think one thing we definitely call out, and Michael and me having some discussion in the past as well. What challenges do organization commonly face when implementing GitOps at scale? And I wanted to learn the new ways to overcome them.
So there are quite a few, and it always depends on your organization. Some common ones are difficulty making multi-tenancy and self-service work well, as you realize, okay, well, I've got to better control what goes to the cluster and split up teams differently. That can be challenging. Performance can always be an issue. You continue to onboard new teams, and the controller slows down. For me, the one I've been focused on recently, it doesn't necessarily have directly to do with GitOps or Argo CD. It has more to do with just config management in general. Organizations that get to a scale where they feel the need to provide an IDP, so an interface to the developers to manage cloud resources and run services specifically within a given organization. Defining those IDPs and still using GitOps the way people generally understand GitOps is challenging. So probably best to understand it with some examples. I'll walk you through Intuit's history of our config management in our IDP. In the early days, the way we would onboard a new service to our IDP is we would create a new GitHub repository for the team. That gives us a nice container for these people to work in. We can use GitHub Teams to manage access. That's all great. We would template and vend out raw Kubernetes manifests, and then we would set up the GitOps operator to deploy that for them. So the developer's interface to our platform was first, click a button, and it creates this repo and this YAML for you. Two, maintain that YAML. The problem is the developer generally doesn't care about most of that YAML. So we wanted to abstract some of that away. And eventually we moved to customize overlays. So we have a common repository with the customized manifests that we use for every service. And then there are a number of flavors of those services, but one repo. Then we vend out customized manifests instead of raw Kubernetes manifests, and we have references back to that common repo, so a remote base in customized terms. The problem is there are two main problems. One, you're still vending out a lot of YAML. For us, it's about 1,000 lines, depending on the style of application you're deploying. That's a lot of YAML. Two, you are still tied to external APIs, specifically whatever version of Kubernetes APIs existed when you vended that repository and any CRD versions, as well as the version of Customize for which those vended overlays, patches, etc. worked. And Customize has breaking changes just like Kubernetes. So what Intuit has found is that when we need to make changes to that configuration that work for our platform, for example, bumping to a new Kubernetes API version, we have two options. Either we as a platform team manually go to thousands, like 5,000 different deployment repositories and make the changes for the developer, or we generate pull requests. And sometimes those pull requests aren't generated properly because these developers have made changes to their manifests that we didn't anticipate. So you have an absolutely terrible time upgrading Kubernetes and customized versions when you vended all that YAML. What we have found is that it is necessary to build a minimal internal API for our developers and then convert that small manifest to the actual Kubernetes manifests before we deploy them. The problem is GitOps tooling isn't great for that today. We still want our developers to be able to see the Kubernetes manifests. So when a developer goes to make a change in their small YAML file, we need to generate for them a preview of, well, what is this actually going to do to your cluster config? The tool doesn't exist today, at least not in the open source world, to generate that preview for them. So that's one example of a feature that I think the ecosystem needs in order for GitOps to continue to progress and still be useful for big organizations with big IDPs. That was a long answer, but hopefully some of those problems and solutions resonated with the audience.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely, definitely. I think this is some sort of a key, or you can say universal challenges when adopting to the Argo CD at high scale, when you're operating with a multiple teams, having multiple clusters, and sometimes if they do have some different requirements based on their business or configuration setting, the thing you spoke about is easily resonate with the folks who actually operating cluster at scale. I think that can easily accelerate on this point as well. But I think we definitely call out to on the topic of this discussion is you have been into the KubeCon Paris. I saw some of the you actually a welcoming note coming from you. I did a talk on there. Do let us know what are the lesson you have learned from KubeCon Paris and particularly the GitOps Con.
For me, the keyword for KubeCon Paris was validating. My coworker Zach and I gave a talk at ArgoCon about the need for previewing changes, for a system for promoting and reverting changes in a really strong GitOps manner. And what we heard when we worked the Argo booth and just after our talk was a lot of people saying, yes, these are exactly the problems I'm having. There's too much YAML. My developers don't feel in control of what they're deploying. And I don't feel empowered to help them be in control of what they're deploying. So there was a lot of strong resonation with that talk and a lot of eagerness to see the proposals for new Argo CD features and be part of the process of even implementing them. So that was my biggest takeaway from KubeCon Paris, is that people are feeling some of the scale pain points of GitOps, and they're excited to see new tooling to resolve those for them and new patterns to resolve those for them.
Absolutely. And I think one question we've been actually chatting offline, but definitely we wanted to see how folks are actually saying. How often do you see the new release of Kubernetes break Argo CD cluster? How often this happen? Or is it a challenging to actually align the new releases of Kubernetes with the Argo CD new functionality? Or is it a very unique injection? You always happy with the releases?
We've actually been pretty happy with our ability to remain compatible with recent versions. At its core, Argo CD is kubectl in a loop. And Kubernetes does a very good job of making sure that the current API server is compatible with relatively old versions of kubectl. So we tend to lag Kubernetes by a few versions in our libraries. And it tends to work just fine. We have EDE tests that we update to basically loop over the most recent few versions of Kubernetes. And we've encountered every now and then some breaking, surprising change. But for the most part, things tend to just work, which is pretty sweet.
Absolutely, absolutely. And before I let you go, one other question I want to learn from you, because you have worked with a lot of the customers, communities, and different. What are the one good real world use cases or success stories of organization that have adopted GitOps for their platform operations?
Yeah, I think Intuit is a pretty great success story for using GitOps. I will preface the answer with we have faced the challenges of managing an IDP via GitOps that so many have faced, and we're learning a lot right now. But the fact that so much of the configuration that gets deployed at Intuit goes through GitOps, and we do have that strong audit trail, and we do have connections to GitHub Teams so that permissions are set up nicely. GitOps has enabled us to have a lot of confidence about what is running in the cluster, who is able to make changes in the cluster, and I think that allows us to keep a level of stability and a high level of quality in our services that's difficult to achieve without leaning into GitOps.
Yes, absolutely. I will include the link for the Intuit, so you can actually look out for the some of the functionality they brings in for you for your GitOps day zero operation to till the months and weeks of progression with the GitOps. But before I let you off, the final question I usually ask, but I might add a few more words into it. Michael, five key takeaways and some predictions for GitOps for remaining part of this year.
Oh, five is a lot. Okay. One takeaway from this last year for me is use secrets operators in the cluster, or use sealed secrets when deploying secrets in a GitOps system. Injecting secrets via config management plugins or using Helm lookups, it has a lot of downsides that I won't detail for the moment, but I think we need to see a movement towards secrets operators. Second, I think that we're going to see a lot of folks talk about developer APIs and the need for minimal APIs to expose platform capabilities to developers, because otherwise you can't maintain your system when you expose all of Kubernetes directly to developers. So I think this next year will be a year of people balancing how much access they give to developers and what those APIs look like. Three more. This may be challenging. Those are the big ones for me. I do think there's going to be more discussion of strong and weak GitOps, of the advantages and disadvantages of injecting information in general, not just secrets, into the manifest hydration process, like right before those manifests hit the cluster. I think that folks are going to start enumerating the pros and cons there, and people are going to pick which direction they want to go based on that. But I'm not sure that the discussion has been had in detail there yet. I think that for my last two, I'll use new Argo CD features I want to push. One takeaway is we need previews. Manifest hydration is complicated. Developers can't intuitively predict what their change in the repo is going to affect on the cluster. We have to have PR previews to show developers, okay, here's the effect of what you're changing. I'm going to be working on getting that feature into Argo CD. And then finally, this is going to be a huge year for promotion, environment promotion in GitOps. We've got CodeFresh coming out with new environment promotion tooling. Acuity has Cargo. I'm working on a proposal that is based on automatically merging pull requests. So we're going to find out what people like to do when managing environment promotion in GitOps among the variety of tools that are coming up. I think it's going to be 2 years before we have any clear idea which of those is the strongest approaches to the problem.
Yes, absolutely. And I think during the discussion, I literally want the preview feature is absolutely a great one because a lot of the different tooling who do have these kind of feature before deploying it's tell us, oh, these are the different things happen on the cluster if you deploy or hit a button. So
Yep.
if that's Argo CD has it, this is a killer one because this essentially tells for someone who actually really new into the Argo CD, or what actually you're doing is actually disturbs that portion of it. Let's be careful and do actually analyze the prediction what is going to happen next. So that's been a great one. I'm looking forward to it as well. And also the environment progression. I see this is happening in different places. A bunch of the KubeCoN talks is actually talk
Mhm.
about it, this persona. And I think kind of a preview environment progression is natural when you're actually deploying to the cluster more often. So
Yeah.
happily, I think these are the two best news for me as well. And great, we have some wonderful discussion going on in the chat. Thanks, Zubair, Philip, and Luke Phillips and Carlos for joining us. And Carlos, do let me know if you wanted to chat about Sanu on this channel and how this is actually creating some IDPs and GitOps pattern. Happy to talk to you about on this channel as well because I see there are some great interest going on in this group as well, and I wanted to learn from you as well. So, just a final question is because today is today or tomorrow, I guess, but it's for me is a today is Kubernetes V.130, the new release. But Michael is very later involved in very later stages into these projects for Argo CD and Kubernetes. Michael, what is your best release in Kubernetes with your history of working in cloud native so far?
My best release, like my favorite Kubernetes release?
Yes.
Oh, well, obviously 1.30 because it's Kubernetes and that's just adorable and amazing.
Oh yes, absolutely. I haven't able to look up all the newest feature, but the logo is absolutely
It's
shining.
perfect.
It's absolutely catchy and really shout out the folks who actually created it. I think based on the theme of Kubernetes and the logos, this will be the best one.
Absolutely.
Without any doubt, it is a great name, great logo, and I think great congrats to Kat, who is I think the release lead for this Kubernetes 1.30, and all to the folks who actually done incredibly hard work pulling this up. But thank you very much for joining us on the show. Some great friend with us today on this YouTube channel is a big player when you have some great chat going on in the YouTube description. But these are the people for you if you wanted to keep track of what is GitOps, where it's heading, and how to get to involved into this ecosystem as well. Michael, Carlos, Luke, and Zubair is your friend for this community. But thank you very much, Michael. It's your second time appearing on the show. I'll keep you making you keep you busy so we can have more content going on. But it's been a great talking to you once again. Have a wonderful day. Stay happy and have a great GitOps year ahead.
Thanks so much. Have a great day, everyone.